Let's move now to a story causing a sharp divide among U.S. Supreme Court justices. Two death row inmates given a stay of execution Monday after challenging the source of lethal injection drugs. Lawyers for Clayton Lockett and Charles Warner filed the latest of several appeals to the Oklahoma Supreme Court asking to grant a delay while there was still time. And the judges there came to a 5-4 decision in favor of the stay just one day before Clinton Lockett was scheduled to be executed. The legal teams for the inmates argue untested drug combinations could amount to cruel and unusual punishment. Last month, the state district court declared that a 2011 supplier secrecy law, which officials said they needed to coax companies to supply scarce execution drugs, was unconstitutional. The Oklahoma Attorney General Scott Pruitt called the appeals nothing more than ploys to delay execution, remarking, and I quote, "The Oklahoma Supreme Court has acted in an extraordinary and unprecedented manner, resulting in a constitutional crisis for our state." So that's the situation there in Oklahoma. There's another U.S. Supreme Court case we'll discuss in just a second, but since the meter is running, metaphorically speaking, we have our friend Michelle Suskauer, our resident legal defense member, criminal defense lawyer. She joins us, as does Morgan Thompson. Michelle, before we get to the U.S. Supreme Court and something that politicians worry about, what about this case in Oklahoma involving the two death row inmates?
I think this is an intriguing case. There's so much that's going on, and I think this is really just the beginning of a tremendous amount of litigation across the country. Really what we have here is there's one particular lethal injection drug that has really been in very scarce supply since 2011 because it is coming from Europe. Actually, the EU, the European Union, has banned the supply to the United States. And so what has happened is the states that have the death penalty that are using lethal injection, which is the predominant way that we execute in this country, are either hoarding this drug or they are using a variety of different combinations, which is resulting in some really sort of strange things that are happening during executions. And so what's happening is these particular prisoners are saying, look, we have a right to find out exactly what the combination of drugs that are being used. For example, in the last 4 executions in 4 different states across the country, there are 4 different lethal combination cocktails that have been used.
Now, Michelle, this also is happening in Missouri. There was another stay of execution there as well on Monday. So it looks like this is really kind of spreading across the country, and rightly so. What about other methods of execution? Are they going to just say, okay, well, we can't regulate this, let's go back to, you know, the chair?
And there's one state in the country, it's Utah, that actually uses a firing squad. And so there are some that are not using lethal injection, but you can't just snap your fingers and say, oh, by the way, we're not going to use lethal injection. It needs to go through, of course, you know, the legislature. There needs to be approval. We may see changes in the way that that executions are done in terms of not using lethal injection anymore, or what we may see is certain states either having a moratorium on the death penalty like we're seeing, or what we may see is the death penalty not being used in certain particular states.
And this becomes the crux of the issue. You mentioned the pharmaceutical involved, or the, for lack of a better term, death potion, the solution manufactured by certain EU countries. Of course, so many European nations have gotten rid of capital punishment. It's almost as if there's some sort of marketing embargo in one sense on this, where those nations can register their disdain or disapproval of the United States. But back to our political process.
And by the way, they have.
Right.
Okay.
And so this becomes an economic way to try and withhold the actions of a sovereign nation that still utilizes capital punishment. But Michelle, can you imagine? We've never, correct me if I'm wrong, in the Old West and for any number of years, not only did you have the electric chair or the gas chamber, but and you mentioned the firing squad in Utah, but many states had hanging as their form of execution.
There were.
I don't recall, correct me if I'm wrong, from your study of legal scholarship, any convicted criminals protest the type of rope or the scaffolding that was utilized in hangings?
You know, and in all seriousness, no, you're right. But what we're talking about here is the way that we institute the death penalty, and the way that and I've visited death row in the state of Florida. It is done in a very somber and organized fashion. There are specific rules that need to be used. And what has been done, at least with my research since 1982, is there is a 3-drug combination. The first drug is used as an anesthesia, the second as a paralyzer, and the third stops the inmate's heart. And
but
what
we're
is
not
happening?
dealing, right,
I understand that, but what is going on is that has been upheld, has been constitutional. And what the states are doing now, because there is a lack of this first particular drug, is they're using different combinations.
But there's a doctor present, is there not?
There always has to be a doctor present, but what they're doing is
how are they legally allowed to do that?
How are they legally allowed?
If they can't change the method, they're able to change the drug cocktail.
Well, but the question is, can they do that? Can they go ahead and use drugs that may have, by the way, this first drug that has been in very short supply has a very short,
anesthetic, correct?
That's right, has a very short shelf life, I believe only 4 years. This has again gone on since 2011 about the embargo of this drug. So it's a question of, is this a violation of the Eighth Amendment when you have individuals who are dying?
A doctor there,
right.
You've been on death row. Is that doctor an anesthesiologist, or is it a general practitioner? What kind of doctor
Well, it really
is that?
depends on the statute, but there has to be a medical professional that is there, that is there to witness it, to make sure that the drugs are administered in a particular way, in a particular order, in a particular amount.
But not necessarily an anesthesiologist.
I don't know if it's an anesthesiologist.
I will tell you what strikes me as more than passing curious. Our efforts to take the accused and the convicted and do our best to outlaw cruel and unusual punishment, when many of these perpetrators exacted a cruel and unusual fate on their victims. The irony of us dealing with the rights beyond the accused to those who are convicted, it's something that I find more than passing curious. But let me switch topics for just a second.
Okay, because we could just go on
would
about
go on
this,
and on.
and we obviously have some disagreement here, but that's okay.
Well, here's one where we may have a disagreement as well.
Okay.
The U.S. Supreme Court, and I know whereof I speak on this issue, having been involved in campaigns, there are times when hyperbole, when satire, and when passion overtakes a campaign. In Ohio, there's a law on the books about accuracy in campaigning. The Supreme Court justices heard the case yesterday.
Right.
As I understand it, they were skeptical. Is there a First Amendment right of expression to, well, lack of a better term, right to lie or embellish?
Well, I mean, and we're going to see what the Supreme Court is going to do with this in terms of whether this particular law in Ohio, which criminalizes reckless political speech, lies, whether this is something that is going to be upheld, or whether or not this is a violation of the First Amendment. And this is something where everyone wants to push this case to happen before the midterms. Right. People want to know what they can say and what they can't say. This came out of a pro-life group called the Susan B. Anthony list that put up billboards.
And how does this differ from regular libel or other laws, defaming laws?
And that's the argument as to whether or not there is something, is there something that's protected in this political speech before, whether someone has a right to be generous with their descriptions, for example, of this particular candidate, saying that he is supporting government-funded abortions.
As an attorney, isn't it difficult often to prove the line between a lie or a mistruth, or where that is? I mean, aren't they setting themselves for a lot of problems here, a very litigious election cycle?
Well, I think that's why this case was pushed, and that's why that the justices accepted it, and that's why the oral argument just happened. And I think we're going to see a decision in June about what can be said and what can't be said.
To expound on what John's saying, the defense for libel and slander is the truth. So this is the complete opposite. Now they're saying you can lie. I mean, the truth is protected under the First Amendment, but lies, to my understanding, are not.
But understand, there is an artful way. I know, having been the target of these kind of ads, there is an artful way to stop just short of a blatant untruth. Or there is the famous case in Florida politics when George Smathers challenged Claude Pepper for the U.S. Senate nomination way back in the 1950s. He went over to the area around the Gulf Coast, and he said, I believe the words were, "My opponent's sister is a known thespian who has been seen masticating publicly." Now, what was he saying? You translate
She's an actor and she chews in public.
She's an actress who chews in public in restaurants. But this is part of the crux of the problem. Politically, it's often the presentation. And then you're also dealing not so much with facts, but with perceptions. And I always think back, showing my age here, Time Life used to have a series on the mind or how the brain works, and they'd have this picture. I said, what do you see here? A goblet or two faces in profile?
Right.
So it becomes a cognitive thing. Truth is often in the eye of the beholder or the voter. That's why I think this Ohio law is problematic.
I think it's problematic, and what's interesting is you had amicus briefs, friends of the court briefs that were on both sides, really, of the aisle. You had the right and the left supporting this free speech. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how the court comes down on this one.
Michelle Suskauer, we appreciate your incisive legal commentary. We may not always be unanimous on these subjects,
and
but
that's
we
what makes it
appreciate
interesting.
Absolutely. Land of the free and the home of the brave.
That's
Morgan
right.
and John, we thank you for weighing in as well. Your take on this, the First Amendment, and your thoughts politically. Is this Ohio law on the right track, or do you think the Supreme Court will strike it down? Your First Amendment rights can be exercised via social media on Twitter @NewsmaxTV, #AmericasForum. You can email us. You can also use Facebook to get in touch. We're coming back with more on America's Forum.